In Birmingham in 1918, a plain-spoken detective boiled an entire existence into a single line, calling Alice Tatlow one of the worst characters the city had to contend with. It was a harsh label for someone who would face the magistrates more than 100 times, a verdict that seems to close a life before it even opens. Yet that reputation, hammered out in the courts and alleys of Britain's industrial heartlands, began far from the soot and the shouting. Her first breath was taken under the canopy of empire, not under tenement rafters. She started as the respectable child of a soldier serving the crown, a daughter born into the clatter and ceremony of a military world overseas. The question that haunts every page that follows is simple and merciless. How does a child of regimental order, baptised under the British flag abroad, become a familiar name in charge sheets and police ledgers at home? To answer, we have to stitch together the scattered pieces her life left behind: official returns, census lines, clipped columns in provincial papers, and watch a slow human unravelling that no headline could ever fully hold. The first trace appears as a return from the British India Office, not the usual parish book one expects in a Midland story. It records a birth on 27 August 1877, in a garrison town noted there as Jhansi, Bengal, and a baptism a fortnight later, on 12th September. Her parents are named plainly, John and Mary Ann Tatlow. In one sheet of paper sits a compressed biography of origins. Jhansi was not a lazy village, or a merchant quarter, but a military hub, a cantonment where marching feet measured out the day. That detail fixes the family inside the apparatus of empire. John Tatlow was no factory hand and no farm labourer. He kept company with regiments. In the final decades of the 19th century, after rebellion and reprisals had remade Britain's rule on the subcontinent, troop numbers swelled, outposts thickened, and with them came wives and children into guarded towns that still leaked risk and loneliness. Those who lived behind the cantonment walls endured heat and fevers, sanitation that failed too often, and the ache of distance that no letter home could shrink. Simply for Alice to survive infancy in that setting is its own small act of endurance, a victory we would overlook if the record did not politely insist she had been there. The file closes and opens again in England. The 1881 census finds the Tatlows back on home soil, lodged among the huts and order of South Camp, Aldershot, then, as now, the army's beating heart. The entry is a compact vignette. John is listed as an armourer sergeant in the 109th Regiment of Foot, the kind of post only the careful and capable are trusted to hold. It was skilled responsibility. He kept rifles clean, bayonets serviceable, pistols sound. He answered for the health of tools that, in a soldier's hands, meant the line between life and death. In that rigid hierarchy he stood as a senior non-commissioned man, a fixed point other ranks gravitated around. Mary is there as his wife, and among the children is Alice, 3 years old, already labelled scholar, the first flicker of a life in letters. The column that lingers reads simply, Birthplace India. That one word would trail her through the registers like a watermark, announcing both where she began and how the empire had wrapped around her family. Imagine her childhood noises: bugle calls splitting the morning, the thud of close-order drill, the stamped discipline of barracks life. It was a rhythm that admitted little chaos, an architecture of days designed to keep disorder and idleness away. A decade later, the page turns. The 1891 census shifts the setting from parade ground to foundry smoke. The family has decamped to Birmingham, settling on Lower Tower Street in the parish of St Nicholas, among rows of houses pressed close to the city's clanking trades. The entry startles in its implications. Mary is listed as head of household, with 6 children under her hand. John and Robert, the older boys, have already been swallowed by Birmingham's brass trade, earning in a city that styled itself the workshop of the world. And there is Alice, 12 years old, still properly noted as born in India. What is not written is as telling as what remains. John, the father who once stood so visibly in the role, is absent on census night. Perhaps he was with a posting, perhaps simply away, the army's needs once again outranking domestic certainties. For a girl on the brink of adolescence, it meant a formative stretch of years shaped by a mother's grit in the city's din, without a constant daily ration of her father's uniformed order. The jump from Aldershot's clean geometry to Birmingham's rattling improvisation must have felt like stepping from map to maze. The paper trail of ordinary life goes quiet for a while after that. Then, in March 1901, a small notice in the Aberystwyth Observer hums faintly with a future we will come to know too well. A domestic servant from Birmingham named Violet Beardsmore appears in court for being drunk and disorderly. On its face, the item seems unremarkable. Drink charges were as common as rain. Yet the report adds a detail that nudges the reader to look closer. She appeared to be in a very distressed state, and instead of imposing punishment, the magistrates ordered she be treated at the infirmary. It is a note of mercy and a recognition that her offence likely rose from a deeper wound than the fine could touch. The name, too, Violet Beardsmore, will become a key in the lock later on. For now, consider what that tells us if Violet and Alice are one. A working-class young woman adrift in service, long hours for little money, few protections, and a culture where the bottle often offered the shortest door out of a day's drudgery. By February 1904, the Birmingham Mail carries a different kind of entry. This time, a report on a fatal quarrel. A room heavy with drink, words sharpened into threats, a razor's glint. Among the witnesses, the paper names Alice Tatlow. She is not in the dock. She is the voice that confirms what happened. She saw the blade drawn, heard the threat, watched a quarrel veer toward tragedy. It places her in rooms where desperation and alcohol mixed freely, in streets where shouting travelled fast and the night's edge cut both ways. That autumn, the tone changes from observer to sufferer. An October report starkly titled "Unconscious in the Police Cell" names her again. Arrested for obtaining drink while on the blacklist, she is found by a constable on the cell floor, a length of tape knotted tightly around her neck. It takes 20 minutes to bring her back. She's charged with attempted suicide. In 1904, that act was a crime. Nothing in the earlier paperwork prepares you for the bleakness of that image. Here is a life smashing against its limits, in a cell designed to hold bodies, but not their despair. The mention of the blacklist matters too. That register, created under legislation aimed at habitual drunkards, legally barred certain people from being served alcohol. To be on it at 27 means her struggle with drink was already known to the authorities and hardened into routine. 2 years later, the Nottingham Journal records a further descent. In February 1906, a court sentences Alice Tatlow of Buck Street, Birmingham, to 3 months' imprisonment for stealing a watch from a man insensible with drink. The irony is bitter enough to sting. A woman who has been destroyed by alcohol is now preying on someone else overtaken by it. The paper notes she's on the blacklist and has 23 previous convictions. The armourer sergeant's daughter has become a familiar presence in the dock, trapped in a circuit of intoxication, small theft and short grinding terms behind bars. In 1908 the geography shifts, but not the weather of her days. A brief piece in the Paddington Times records that a woman named Mary Moorcroft received a month's sentence for assaulting Alice on Euston Road. The city is now London. The hazards are the same. Here Alice is the injured party, an episode that reminds us that the street took as often as it gave, and that vulnerability and violence shadowed her from both sides of the law. By 1913, Birmingham reclaims her, and the reports grow colder. The Nuneaton Observer carries a magistrate's comment as biting as frost. A man named Arthur Franklin is given the maximum 6 months for what the bench calls one of the meanest cases he had heard, living on the earnings of Alice Tatlow. The phrase was a euphemism the courts used often, and its meaning is not ambiguous. Franklin was taking her money as she sold her body. The figure named in evidence, around £5 a week, runs miles ahead of factory wages and leaves little doubt about the work keeping roof and food in place. She was paying the rent, furnishing the table, and handing over to a man whose grip was parasitic. The following spring, the reports carry more grief than law. In April 1914, the Evening Dispatch describes a scene that could have ended everything. A railway detective at New Street Station sees a woman step down onto the line calculatedly in front of an oncoming engine. He jumps after her and drags her clear. A witness remarks that another yard would have cut her in two. Her words to the officer are bare and terrible. She does not want to live. She has buried her brother and cannot bear the world that remains. In that sentence, all the unrecorded days become briefly visible. Grief layered atop hardship until the thought of an ending felt like relief. Within weeks, her name is back in the courtroom, and Franklin's reappears beside it. In May 1914, the Birmingham Mail reports Andrew Franklin, almost certainly the same man, tried for robbery with violence against Alice. She tells the court he struck her, knocked her down, kicked her face, and stole a satchel with 15 shillings inside. Another witness supports her account. The verdict nevertheless is not guilty. Acquittal for Alice is another kind of sentence. It underscores how little the law had to offer a woman branded by drink and scandal. Her word weighed less than his, and reputation did more heavy lifting than testimony. War surges over these domestic battles, but it does not erase them. In May 1915, with the country convulsed by anti-German hysteria after the sinking of the Lusitania, the Evening Dispatch records a charge against Alice for breaking an ace doll on plate glass window. Her defence, thrown as an accusation, was that the shopkeeper hoisted a flag when the ship went down, and that he was a German sympathiser. Whether that claim had any truth mattered less in a city bristling with suspicion. She was remanded. The moment shows how the public storms of the age could feed the private turbulence already dragging her under. The pattern by now is relentless. In 1917, the Birmingham Mail numbers the Drumbeat, her 88th court appearance, this time for obscene language on John Bright Street, a notorious district where vice and poverty shared close quarters. 1 month in prison follows, 88 appearances at 36 years old. If you step back from the numbers, you can almost see the life they describe. Short chapters, the same ending, the same beginning, over and over, until the person disappears behind the statistic others use to define her. By January 1918, the file offers up another theft, small in sum but large in implication. A purse lifted from a barmaid. When challenged, she drops it and says she took it for swank, for show. The line carries bravado and exhaustion in equal measure. What bites harder is the court summary. A detective testifies that she has been convicted 82 times, that she preys upon soldiers and sailors in their cups, and that she ranks among Birmingham's worst. The sentence that day, 12 months hard labour, confirms how completely the public narrative has hardened. The papers no longer frame her as a troubled woman or an injured soul whose collapse the system might slow. She is written as a predator, the city's problem to be managed with time and stone and surveillance. But if you set the clipping aside and look back across the record, another portrait remains at the edges. A soldier's child pulled between two worlds. The ordered cadence of the barracks and the anarchic pull of slum streets, carrying an addiction the law could only punish, a defiance that flashed and failed, and a grief that sometimes broke through her armour and drove her toward the tracks. When the First World War tightened its grip on Britain, the city's machinery of justice kept its rhythm. Even as soldiers fell on foreign soil, Alice's name continued to echo through Birmingham's magistrates' courts. The war years only seemed to amplify her misfortunes. Her offences, now mostly tied to drink, defiance and disorder, became an almost ritual recurrence. What had once been viewed as individual missteps were now treated as symptoms of an unchangeable character. By 1920, the Birmingham Daily Gazette recorded an incident that almost reads like a stage piece set for the police. It tells of constables hiding in a doorway on Station Street, waiting for what they already suspected. From their concealed post, they watched Alice and a companion named George Hughes approach an unsuspecting man. The method, the paper notes, was familiar. She placed her arms around the man's neck, embracing him as though greeting an old friend, while Hughes relieved him of his belongings. The officer stepped forward before she could vanish into the night. The precision of the description, the practiced deception, the setting near the railway, suggests this was no sudden lapse but an act perfected through repetition. At 37, Alice was living out the same cycle that had consumed her 20s and 30s, short bursts of freedom punctuated by arrest, sentencing and confinement. The police and the press had long ceased to treat her as an individual with a story. She had become shorthand for a type, the hopeless habitual, the woman beyond reform. Yet, within that relentless repetition, moments of personality still glimmer through the lines of print. She wasn't meek in court. She argued with constables, spoke with biting humour, and seemed, even in chains, unwilling to surrender the small dignity of answering back. Then came 1928, a year that preserved one of the most revealing records of her life. The Evening Dispatch covered her 109th appearance in court, describing her as a woman of 48, well known to the police. The charge, as so often before, was drunkenness at New Street Station. The scene, according to the report, bordered on the theatrical. When fined 20 shillings, she announced with grand bravado that she could pay not just that sum but 50 or even £100 if she wished. The boast was hollow, there's no sign she could afford even the fine, but it was a flash of defiance, an instinct to meet humiliation with performance. Beneath the worn exterior, the habit of surviving through wit and pride still burned. Around this same time, the state's documentation of her existence becomes more intimate, almost clinical. The 1904 Habitual Drunkards Register, compiled during the height of her decline, contains what is perhaps the most direct connection we have to her as a person, rather than a story, her photograph. It is a mugshot, formal and unflinching, meant to catalogue not a life but a face. The entry lists aliases, Annie Harris, and notably Violet Beardsmore, confirming that the woman arrested in 1901 under that name and the Alice of later years were one and the same. Her description runs down the page with bureaucratic precision. 5 feet 1.5 inches tall, stout, fresh complexion, brown hair, blue eyes. Then, beneath those measurable traits, a series of markings. Initials, clasped hands, a heart, the Prince of Wales's feathers, and the words, true love. Each tattoo, a trace of sentiment carved into skin, becomes a kind of accidental autobiography. These were the symbols of someone who had once believed in belonging, in affection, perhaps even in romance, the same qualities life later weaponized against her. A prison calendar from 1918 extends the portrait. It details a catalogue of her convictions: assaults, malicious damage, theft, and 54 separate charges of drunkenness. The numbers are merciless, yet even in their coldness, they confirm something the headlines omit: her persistence. To have survived that many sentences, that many nights in custody, meant she endured conditions that broke countless others. Her body and will were, in some sense, indestructible. The next layer comes from the 1919 Habitual Criminals Register, compiled a year after that calendar. It repeats her physical data, this time marking her height at just under 5 feet. A tiny, almost fragile figure by the standards of the day. It notes again her tattoos, those private emblems the police read as identifiers, but which for her might once have been charms or memories. Her birth year is recorded as 1883 and her birthplace again India. The date is slightly wrong, but close enough to show how her foreign birth clung to her official identity like a ghost. Even the Police Gazette, Britain's national bulletin for tracking offenders, carried her name. In 1921, it lists her under yet another alias, Alice O'Donnell, and adds a fresh physical detail: a scar on her lip. It's a small wound, but telling, an outward mark of the violence that shadowed her life for decades. By then, she had become a living file. Her aliases, height, weight, scars, and tattoos shuffled between police desks across counties, the system that had failed to help her catalogued her with the precision of an archivist. After that vivid 1928 courtroom performance, the Birmingham records fall silent. No further reports of arrests or trials appear in the city's newspapers. For a time, it seems as if she simply vanished from the landscape that had defined her for nearly 30 years. Then, unexpectedly, her name reappears, but in a gentler context. In November 1929, the Coventry Herald printed a curious little notice. Alice Tatlow of the Larches, Clay, Warwickshire, was fined 7 shillings and 6pence for riding a bicycle without a rear light. The offence itself is almost comic in its mildness, the kind of trivial infraction respectable villagers committed by accident. Could this really be the same woman once branded as one of Birmingham's worst? The thought lingers. The age matches. She would have been 51, and the name is far from common. Could it be that, in the calm fields of Warwickshire, Alice had found a brief pocket of ordinary life? The contrast between the earlier decades of theft, drink and despair and this almost pastoral misdemeanour is so stark it feels like an illusion. But history is filled with such quiet fade-outs. People who lived furiously in one chapter sometimes retreat into anonymity for the next. Perhaps she had sought refuge from the city that had defined and destroyed her, or perhaps the name in the paper was coincidence, a different woman entirely. The records leave the question open. the certainty returns a decade later and many miles away. When Britain conducted its 1939 National Register, a vast civilian census on the eve of the Second World War, one entry finally connects all the fragments. There, at 13 Formosa Street in Paddington, London, lives Alice Tatlow. The date of birth written beside her name, 27 August 1877, matches exactly with the record from India 6 decades earlier. The thread pulls taut across time. She's recorded as married, her occupation given simply as domestic duties. Next to her name, the surname Lane has been written and then crossed out, suggesting some entanglement with a man who shared the household, but perhaps not the law's approval. Indeed, she is listed as living with Henry Lane, a street trader 21 years younger. This domestic arrangement, though humble, hints at something unexpected: stability. For the first time in her adult life, the records place her in a home that wasn't a lodging house, cell, or hospital. There is no mention of police, courts, or fines. Maybe she had found in Henry a partner who could offer companionship without exploitation, or maybe he simply provided shelter from a world that had ceased to care. But peace never held long for Alice. 4 years later, in August 1943, the St Marylebone and Paddington Mercury printed one last story. It described a woman named Alice Moore Tatlow, aged 65, of Homer Row, a short walk from Formosa Street, appearing in court charged with stealing a wallet. The method was achingly familiar. She stopped a man late at night, asked for a cigarette, and while he gave her a light, she took his wallet. When the police confronted her, she insisted, "I can prove I wasn't there." The officers told the court she had a long history of convictions for larceny and drunkenness. There is no hint of remorse in her words, only the same denial and self-possession that had marked her decades earlier. In that final appearance, the cycle had come full circle. From the child of a soldier in India to an elderly woman in wartime London, the pattern endured. Her tactics hadn't changed. Her world, the narrow street corners and the quick deceit born of survival, remained her stage even in old age. The law too had not changed. It could still only punish, not cure. After 1943, her trail vanishes. The newspapers fall silent. For a woman who had lived so visibly under the public eye, her disappearance is almost poetic. It's as though the curtain finally fell and no one noticed. Yet the archives suggest 2 possible endings. One death record appears in Birmingham in 1960, another in Surrey in 1965. Each bears her name, each could plausibly be hers, but neither can be confirmed. Perhaps she died quietly, far from the noise that had once defined her. The surviving documents, the registers, the mugshots, the clipped court reports, tell us what she did, but not who she was inside those moments. Still, patterns emerge. Alice was shaped by 2 great forces of her age: empire and industrial poverty. She was born under the rigid order of the British military, but grew to adulthood in the chaotic freedom of the slums. The discipline of her childhood and the disorder of her environment never reconciled. She belonged to neither world and so was punished by both. What remains striking, though, is her endurance. Through imprisonment, violence, and addiction, she refused to disappear. Even her defiance in court, her sarcastic answers and hollow boasts, feel like acts of self-preservation, a way of asserting identity when every institution sought to strip it away. For the authorities, she was a statistic. For the press, she was spectacle. But beneath those headlines lived a woman still fighting, however futilely, to be seen on her own terms. By the time she faced that final charge in 1943, the Britain she had known was itself collapsing under wartime strain. The empire of her birth was fading, the slums were changing, and the world that had judged her so harshly was unravelling. If she lived to see the peace that followed, perhaps she watched in silence as the system that had branded her one of the worst characters in Birmingham forgot her name altogether. The life of Alice Tatlow is more than a record of crimes and court appearances. When her story is gathered from the fragments scattered across official papers and brittle newspaper columns, it becomes something far richer and more haunting, a portrait of a woman trapped between systems that were built to control, not to understand. Every document, every record, every terse report carries the same undercurrent. She was noticed only when she broke the rules. No one ever recorded the days she did not. Her decline, visible in the public eye from her early 20s, was never sudden. It was a gradual erosion, carved by years of neglect, poverty, and the absence of compassion. The Victorian and Edwardian systems were merciless in their treatment of addiction and mental illness. To be an habitual drunkard was to be branded for life, denied service, employment, and trust. Rehabilitation was not a concept. Punishment was. The police and the courts became the only institutions that acknowledged women like Alice at all. And even then their recognition came only in the form of arrest and sentence. The public viewed such women through a narrow lens. In the popular imagination of early 20th century Britain, the fallen woman, the drunkard, and the prostitute were stock figures used to reinforce the moral order. The newspapers described them with a mix of fascination and disgust, writing of them as warnings, as moral lessons dressed up as local news. But within those stories were hints of something larger, a social order that had no space for women outside the strict bounds of respectability. A woman without a husband, without family protection, and without property could easily fall through every safety net society pretended to offer. Alice's beginnings should have shielded her from that fate. As the daughter of a soldier and the product of imperial respectability, she was not supposed to end up in a police cell. Yet empire itself could be cruel to its own children. Military families stationed abroad lived lives of precarious dignity. When soldiers retired or regiments were reassigned, their dependents were often left to fend for themselves. The army provided structure while it lasted, but once a man's service ended, so did the support. The pensions were small, and jobs for ex-servicemen scarce. For their families, the descent from disciplined order to urban poverty could be swift. In that sense, Alice's life mirrors the fall of a whole generation of working-class families who had served the empire only to return to an England that had no room for them. Birmingham at the turn of the century was a city of contradictions. Industrial wealth on one side, relentless poverty on the other. Rows of narrow back-to-back houses held families crammed into rooms thick with smoke and exhaustion. Children left school early to work. Women laboured in factories or took in laundry. Drink, for many, was the only form of release that cost less than a doctor's visit. The pubs and gin houses of the city's poorer districts were not dens of vice to those who entered them. They were refuges, however destructive, from the grind of survival. When the newspapers called Alice one of the worst characters in Birmingham, they ignored the city that had created her. They never mentioned that her father's regiment had moved her from camp to camp, that she grew up without permanence, that she lived most of her youth amid strangers. They never considered what it meant to be a young woman moving through the industrial streets without protection, expected to serve others as a maid for pennies, and to carry herself with dignity no one else afforded her. Her first recorded breakdown, the suicide attempt in 1904, did not emerge from nowhere. It was a culmination of years of quiet despair. To wake up every morning with nothing to lose and yet be condemned for trying to numb that emptiness, that was the paradox of women like her. Society demanded virtue while denying the conditions that allowed it. Even her attempt on her own life was treated as a legal offence, not a cry for help. The system she lived under could only answer pain with punishment. By the time she appeared in court during the Great War, Britain itself was cracking under the same pressure that had long consumed her. The nation that had once ruled half the world was bleeding its youth in the trenches of France. The moral codes that had kept the poor in their place began to blur under the weight of loss and uncertainty. Yet, for all that change, the treatment of women like Alice stayed the same. The jails filled with them. Petty thieves, beggars, alcoholics, those deemed beyond saving. One might imagine her walking through the streets of wartime Birmingham, watching soldiers in uniform pass by, the same kind of men her father once commanded weapons for. The same empire that had given her family purpose had given her nothing. The irony is too sharp to ignore. The soldier's daughter, who now preyed upon soldiers' wages to survive. But that was not villainy. It was desperation wearing its last disguise. The tattoos listed in her record offer an unexpected window into that contradiction. The heart, the clasped hands, the true love, symbols of loyalty, intimacy and hope, stood in painful contrast to the life she endured. Tattoos in her era were not fashionable ornaments, they were declarations, marks of belonging or memory. They might have tied her to someone she once loved, a fellow wanderer in the industrial underclass, or perhaps simply to the romantic ideals she never stopped chasing, even as life eroded them. Every arrest photograph that noted those marks inadvertently recorded the persistence of her humanity, the proof that even in degradation, she carried something of tenderness inside her. When she moved to London in her later years, the city offered anonymity but no absolution. Paddington and Marylebone were districts of stark extremes, grand avenues only a few streets away from crumbling lodging houses. For many older women on the margins, the capital's sprawl became both a hiding place and a trap. You could vanish in London, but survival demanded tricks the law would never tolerate. Her last recorded offence in 1943, stealing a wallet through sleight of hand, was not new deceit but the continuation of skills long practiced: distraction, timing, the ability to read another's momentary carelessness. These were the talents of survival, sharpened by decades on the edge. Her refusal to surrender even then carries a certain tragic courage. She was 65, an age when most people of her generation were already gone. Yet she was still standing in a courtroom, facing authority with the same mixture of defiance and resignation that had defined her youth. Her insistence, "I can prove I wasn't there," was more than denial. It was pride. It was the last defense of a woman who had learned that confession brought nothing but contempt. When her paper trail fades after that, it feels intentional, as if the universe finally allowed her some measure of privacy. The silence after decades of exposure is almost merciful. If one of those later death records truly belongs to her, then she lived well into the post-war years, perhaps into her 80s. A remarkable span for someone who had spent half her life in prison or on the streets. Imagine her walking through a changed Britain of televisions and ration books, the empire that birthed her gone, the class structures that crushed her beginning to crumble. No one would have recognised the small, stout woman with the heart tattoo as the figure once condemned in headlines. There is a haunting symmetry in that anonymity. For 40 years, the authorities had documented every detail of her existence: her height, her scars, her addresses, her crimes. Then, in her final years, she slipped free of them all. The system that once claimed to know her completely lost her at last. In the end, she achieved the one thing she had been denied for most of her life: invisibility on her own terms. Historians and genealogists who stumble upon her name today often describe her as a curiosity, a footnote in the annals of habitual offenders, yet her story resonates far beyond its time. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about how societies manufacture their outcasts. Alice Tattelow was not born to be a criminal. She was born into an empire that prized order but ignored compassion, into a century that punished weakness as moral failure. Her life was a ledger written by institutions that could record but never rescue. What endures, then, is not her criminal record but her resilience. Through every imprisonment she surfaced again. Through every act of humiliation she retained the spark to answer back. She was, in her own fractured way, indestructible. Her body bore the proof of her battles, the tattoos, the scar on her lip, the lines etched by years of survival. They read like scripture carved into skin, the testament of someone who refused to vanish quietly. If there is a lesson in her story, it lies not in condemnation but in empathy. Behind the statistics and the scorn was a human being who experienced loss, love, fear, and hope like anyone else. The records show us her transgressions. The silences between them hint at her pain. For every theft, there was hunger. For every drunken night, there was grief. For every outburst in court, there was the frustration of never being heard. The soldier's daughter who became Birmingham's outcast remains a mirror to her age, and uncomfortably to ours. In every era, there are people whose struggles are criminalised instead of healed, whose despair becomes entertainment for others. Alice's life reminds us that what we call crime is often the language of suffering translated into action. Her story, stripped of sensationalism, is not about wickedness. It is about survival in a world that offered no mercy to the weak. And so, when the trail ends and the records fall silent, we might imagine her final years not as defeat but as escape, a quiet retreat from the judgment of others, a life reduced at last to simple anonymity. Somewhere, perhaps in a modest room in Birmingham, or a rented flat in Surrey, The soldier's child who fought her 4-decade war against poverty and addiction might finally have found rest. When we step back from the countless records and grim headlines, what remains of Alice Tatlow is something far more human than the label she carried. The police files defined her through repetition: habitual drunkard, thief, prostitute. But those words flatten a lifetime into categories that hide more than they reveal. Her journey was not one of simple moral failure. It was the product of a rigid society that offered punishment where compassion was needed, silence where understanding could have saved her. To understand her final years, one must consider the world that surrounded her. Britain after the Second World War was not the same country that had judged her decades earlier. The empire of her birth was in retreat. The working classes were finding new voices through reform, and the welfare state was beginning to emerge. For the first time, there was the faint promise of social care, housing and support for those on the margins. But for Alice, born in 1877, these changes likely came too late. She had lived most of her life under laws designed to discipline the poor, not to uplift them. If she lived into the 1950s or early 1960s, as those uncertain death records suggest, she would have been an old woman moving through a world that had forgotten how fiercely it once punished her kind. In post-war Birmingham or the suburbs of Surrey, she would have been one of countless elderly figures who had known the roughest edges of Victorian and Edwardian Britain and survived them. It is not hard to imagine her sitting quietly near a window, a small, stout woman with weathered skin and faded tattoos, the noise of passing traffic replacing the cries of street markets she once haunted. Her life, though tragic, tells us much about the transformation of women's roles in Britain. In her youth, independence in a woman was viewed as defiance. By the time she was old, it was becoming something to be celebrated. The very qualities that condemned her, stubbornness, resilience, refusal to submit, would, in another generation, be recognised as strength. But Alice lived before such recognition was possible. For her, those traits were merely more fuel for the courts to label her incorrigible. The fascination surrounding her, even in later newspaper coverage, reflects society's uneasy relationship with women who defied convention. Reporters wrote about her as if she were a spectacle, an oddity who refused to conform to the script of repentance. They missed that she had no script at all, only survival. Her story exposes how the press often turned human suffering into moral theatre, a performance designed to reassure the comfortable that justice still worked. Yet, if one reads those same articles against the grain, there are flashes of empathy buried within the scorn. The constables who pulled her from the railway line, the magistrates who ordered medical care instead of prison, even the journalist who recorded her defiant courtroom quip. They each glimpsed the person behind the reputation, if only for a moment. Those small mercies form the only evidence of compassion she might have received. Her repeated suicide attempts are perhaps the most heartbreaking thread running through her history. They were not acts of self-destruction born of weakness, but cries against invisibility. To live constantly under judgment is its own kind of death. To reach a point where even that judgment seems preferable to silence reveals the depth of her despair. When she stepped toward the train tracks in 1914, it was not only grief for her brother that pushed her, it was the unbearable weight of being seen only through failure. The records also capture the way institutions shaped identity. Each alias, Violet Beardsmore, Annie Harris, Alice O'Donnell, marks an attempt at reinvention, a new mask to outrun her past. But bureaucracy is relentless. The police registers always caught up, matching tattoos, scars and handwriting, until every new name collapsed back into the old one. In this, her life becomes an allegory for anyone trying to escape a past that society refuses to let them shed. Every record keeper, every constable, every reporter became a kind of historian writing her life in fragments, often with no awareness of the person they were preserving. That obsessive documentation has paradoxically given her a kind of immortality. Without it, Alice Tatlow would have vanished like so many others. Instead, she survives in ink, her name preserved in ledgers, her image frozen in a mugshot, her story reconstructed more than a century later. The same system that condemned her ensured she would not be forgotten. In that way, she stands as a witness for countless unnamed women whose lives followed similar paths but left no trace. For every Alice, there were hundreds of others, unrecorded, unremembered, erased by anonymity. She's both singular and representative, her story carrying the weight of many. The duality of her life, discipline and chaos, respectability and ruin, mirrors the contradictions of Britain itself in her time. She was born at the height of imperial confidence and died in its twilight. The British Army, which gave her father rank and respect, also set the conditions that would later leave his family vulnerable. The Empire's promise of order abroad created disarray at home, filling cities with returning soldiers and displaced families struggling to adapt. In a sense, Alice's life charts the moral cost of empire, not in battlefields or colonies, but in the inner lives of those it failed to protect once their usefulness ended. If one looks for redemption in her story, it lies not in transformation but endurance. Redemption implies change, a clear turning point leading from darkness to light. Alice had no such moment. Her victories were smaller, surviving another winter, finding a bed for the night, answering back to a judge instead of hanging her head. Her existence was a quiet rebellion against the idea that only the respectable deserve to be remembered. The sparse details of her final decades, the bicycle fine, the domestic address in Paddington, the old age theft, suggest a woman who continued to move through life on her own terms, even as the world softened around her. That stubbornness once punished becomes her legacy. It is the thread that runs unbroken from the Indian garrison of her birth to the London backstreets of her old age. In the end, what do we make of the phrase that defined her? One of the worst characters in Birmingham. It tells us nothing about her, and everything about the society that coined it. To label a woman worst for being poor, addicted and alone was to absolve everyone else of responsibility. It was easier to call her dangerous than to ask how she became so desperate. The cruelty of that simplification is what echoes most strongly now, long after the courts and cells have crumbled into dust. If history has any justice, it lies in re-examining those judgments. To read her record today is to see the humanity that her contemporaries ignored. The faded photograph of her in the habitual drunkard's register does not show a monster. It shows a woman with clear eyes, a slightly guarded expression, and the faint trace of someone who once smiled easily. Her tattoos, now symbols of rebellion, speak of affection and memory. Her repeated defiance in court reveals a mind still unwilling to surrender its dignity. Perhaps that is the true meaning of her story. Not ruin, but resistance. The empire, the courts, the prisons, all sought to define her, yet none succeeded completely. Even in failure, she asserted herself, even in captivity, she remained visible, and in the end she left behind a puzzle that refuses to fade. No one can say exactly when or where her story ended. Perhaps she died quietly in Birmingham, the city that once branded her irredeemable. Perhaps she passed in Surrey, far from the streets that had known her for so long. Wherever she rests, her grave, marked or unmarked, belongs to a woman who lived through the entire spectrum of British history's contradictions. She was born into an empire and died in its shadow. She began as a soldier's daughter and ended as a symbol of survival against indifference. If we could speak to her now, perhaps we would find not bitterness, but a weary understanding. She might remind us that morality is often a privilege of the comfortable, and that endurance can be a kind of grace. Her life, for all its turbulence, stands as a reminder that even those written off as lost are still part of the story that defines us all. So when the records fall silent after 1943, that silence does not erase her. It completes her. It is the long-delayed mercy of obscurity, the peace denied to her in life. The soldier's daughter, who fought her own 4-decade war against hunger, addiction and judgment, finally disappears into history's quiet. And in that quiet, perhaps, she found the rest she was denied in every noisy courtroom and every damp cell.